wants to go back and look at any of this. Okay, in the long run, we are at the natural rate of output, right? We are at the natural rate of output, regardless of what the price level is. The price level doesn't matter in the long run, right? If we doubled all the prices in the economy and our nominal wages doubled, it doesn't make any difference. What determines how rich we are in the long run? Well, this is everything we talked about in chapter 9. Productivity, right? Our natural rate is a function of productivity, specifically our human capital, our physical capital, and our technology. These are the things that matter in the long run. Not the price level, not the price level. And that idea is what we call money neutrality. In the long run, nominal variables don't impact real variables. Okay, so what's output? This is real output. That's a real variable. What's the price level? Nominal. So in the long run, changes in the price level don't impact real variables, right? And think back to that example I used in class about the green dollar bills and the red dollar bills, right? Doubling the money supply and doubling prices, yeah, it changes the price level, but it shouldn't impact anything that really matters. It shouldn't impact our ability to produce, because as long as we have the same amount of physical capital, human capital, and technology, we should have the same output. But as we talked about, you have to think about this as a long-run concept, because in the short run, it's a lot more complicated. In the short run, we could have sticky wages, or we could have imperfect information. And so in the short run, it's possible the price level could impact output because we have market failure, right? In the term, once again, in the form of inflexible wages or imperfect competition. But in the long run, we don't, right? In the long run, we always come back to that natural rate where output is kind of at full employment, right? That we're fully employing all the resources at our disposal. So money neutrality is a long-run concept, but it's the whole point of Keynesian economics is it's not a short-run concept. That in the short run, things are a lot more complicated, right? Particularly because of different types of market failures in terms of imperfect information and inflexible wages. Does that clear things up, Evan?
Yeah, so you're basically just saying that price just has no impact on productivity.
Yeah, because I mean, think about what prices are. They're just they're a way of measuring value, right? So once again, I'll appeal to another example I used in class, which is a clock, right? A clock is a nominal value. We've attached 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock to different parts of the day. But what's a real value? Where the sun is, right? So during daylight savings time, we change the value of our clocks. We change nominal variables all the time. It doesn't impact real variables. And it's the same with the price level. If I double the money supply by issuing 2 red dollar bills for every green dollar bill, I'm going to double the price level. But that doesn't really make any real difference in the sense that if I double all wages and I double prices, all real value should stay the same.
Okay. Can you go over sticky wages quickly, or just, I guess, both reasons why short run aggregate supply is vertical or slopes upwards?
Well, I mean, we talked about a number of reasons why wages are sticky. We talked about wage contracts. We talked about minimum wage laws. And importantly, we talked about efficiency wages. And really all of these are reasons to suggest that when things get tight for firms, firms prefer layoffs to wage cuts. When it gets down to it, when firms have to cut costs, they would prefer to lay workers off as opposed to cutting their wages. And so what does that mean, for instance, if the price level goes down? If the price level goes down, real wages go up. And firms can't cut their wage because of these things. They can't cut wage because of wage contracts. They can't cut wages because of efficiency wages. They're worried that their best workers are going to leave. They're worried that people are not going to work as hard. And what happens when real wages go up? As we've explained a few times, this leads to layoffs and this cuts production. So in the end, we get this positive relationship here between prices and output, the price level and output. And that's exactly what our short-run aggregate supply curve captures, right? A positive relationship between the price level and output. Okay.
Could you also list out the just like general shifters of aggregate supply and aggregate demand?
So do you have a copy of notes?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm happy to work through problems, but I'm not happy to kind of reiterate everything in my notes. But we talked about 5 things: changes in government purchases, changes in government transfer payments, changes in taxes, changes in the monetary policy, and changes in consumer confidence or expectations. So those are the 5 big things that we talked about that shift aggregate demand.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So,
Is this Isabel? Sorry, it's hard to
yes.
figure out. Okay. Yeah.
So when we're talking about the demand curve, the aggregate demand curve and why it's downward sloping,
Mhm.
you mentioned the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and then the trade balance effect. I think it might also be called the exchange rate effect.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we never went over that, but I just don't have a lot about it in my notes.
And so we really didn't talk about it because we haven't talked about exchange rates yet. So
Okay.
I mentioned it in class because I know it's mentioned in your book, but I'm not going to ask you any questions about it because we haven't talked about exchange rates yet. So I mentioned it just so you know that there's another reason out there, but I'm not going to ask you to explain it. We'll talk about that, a little bit later in class.
Then sort of in addition to that, I also had in my notes another aggregate demand shifter was changes in exports and imports.
Ah, okay, right. I forgot that one. Right, I forgot that one.
And I was
So,
wondering if you could go over that again.
yeah. So remember, when we're talking about aggregate demand, you can think back, right? You can really think back to aggregate demand as being a function. Sorry, I got some sloppy writing here. Aggregate demand is the function of the demand for consumption, demand for investment, demand for government purchases, demand for exports, and demand for imports. So if there's an increase in the demand for exports, this is going to increase aggregate demand, right? Because this is one of the components of demand. Likewise, an increase in imports is going to lead to a reduction in aggregate demand. Oops. A reduction in aggregate demand, because remember, demand for imports is really demand for foreign goods and services, not demand for domestic goods and services. So this is just one of the components of demand, right? Exports and imports are one of the components of demand. We haven't really talked about exports and imports much because that's really where we're going to turn in the 4th week. So Monday and Tuesday, our last couple of days, we're going to spend more time talking about open economy macro and exports and imports. So you know, I probably am not going to ask you many questions. I'm really not going to ask you any questions about this, because it's really something that I think is going to more directly relate to what we talk about the last couple of days in class. So we'll kind of largely save it for then. One of the things you probably have noticed if you've begun studying is that there's plenty for me to ask you about on this exam tomorrow. So I really, you know, I think I said this last time for the first exam, and it's probably even more true for this exam. I don't really have to work at making questions tricky to make this exam hard, right? Or hard enough. So, when I'm thinking about writing the exam and writing questions, you might think I'm trying to be tricky, but I really am not trying to be tricky, right? I'm really trying to ask you directly about things that are related to what we talk about in class. And so, you know, with that in mind, the best advice I can always give you for these exams is to read the question and then think before you start to write. And one of the things you should think about is, how might this relate to some of the things we talked about in class? Right? Because chances are I'm not asking you something that doesn't relate pretty directly in one way or another to something that we talked about in class. Okay, who else has got some questions?
I got a question here. So for the costs and dangers of public debt, could you go over what crowding out means again?
Yeah. So crowding out is actually an idea that we talked about. You actually had a question on this in the first exam. But this is related to our loanable funds market, where we have savings and investment, and this determines the equilibrium interest rate and the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. Okay. So this has to do with the dangers of budget deficits. What happens if we have an increase in the government deficit? This reduces total savings in the economy, because a deficit is really dissaving, right? The government's doing negative saving. This is going to be a reduction in savings within the economy. So a reduction in savings shifts our savings curve in this direction, and it raises interest rates. Notice what this increase in the interest rate does. We move along our investment curve. So notice that when interest rates go up, this reduces the quantity demanded of investment. And so when the government borrows more, we get less investment. And the worry is that that's going to have long-term consequences for our economy, right? If we're investing less, we're going to have less human capital, less physical capital, maybe less technology, and we'll be poorer in the long run. So this is what crowding out is. If you think about this, it's actually a very descriptive term, because what's the government doing here? The government's coming in and borrowing up all the money, and what are they doing? They're pushing private borrowers out. They're crowding them out of the market. The government comes up and sucks up all the savings, and as a result, private borrowers have less. And the result of that is we get less investment. And the worry is that that's going to reduce investment and reduce output in the long run. Now, as we've talked about, crowding out is less of a worry for the United States, in part because we are able to attract this huge amount of foreign savings, right? So remember, this example here that I've gone through, this is a closed economy, where S is equal to I. But the US is an open economy that is very open in the sense that foreigners are extremely happy, for the most part, to be buying US assets. And so as a result, crowding out is not as big an issue in the United States because we have this huge pool of foreign savings that we can fall back on. And so that's how you can kind of reconcile the fact that the US has a big budget deficit, but yet we have low interest rates, right? That in most countries, in Canada, you couldn't have that, right? In Canada, you could not have the Canadian government could not be running big government budget deficits and have low interest rates. Does that help, Bradley?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, who else has got some questions? I'm just getting warmed up. How about I suggest that we do a money multiplier question? All right. You did not take a quiz on chapter 14. A lot in chapter 14, quite honestly, is just kind of definitional stuff. So there's a lot of kind of facts, definitions, right? But the one kind of problem thing that we did in chapter 14 is a money multiplier problem. So let's do that. All right, so let me just give you I'll just make up an example here. So you're given the following information. The required reserve ratio is 15%. Actually, let's make it 20%. It's an easier number. The Fed then conducts an open market sale of $20 million. So they sell $20 million in bonds. What's the change in M1? How much does M1 change? Okay, here's a reasonable example of a question you could see in tomorrow's exam. All right, first off, to be able to do this problem, we got to know what the formula is. What's the formula? Anybody feel free to jump in here.
Isn't it 1 over the required reserve ratio?
1 over the required reserve ratio is equal to what?
The change in M1 over the change in currency.
Exactly. Or the change in reserves, right? Because we know that the Fed doesn't, when they conduct an open market operation, they don't always just change currency. Sometimes they just change reserves. So this is the money multiplier. And let's be clear, this is the max multiplier, right? That's the maximum multiplier. So what's the change in reserves? 20 million. But notice here, is this a positive 20 million or a negative 20 million?
Positive, right?
Sale. When the Fed sells treasury bills, what are they doing? They're taking reserves out of the system. They sell you the bond, they take the money, and they make it disappear, right? So this is a change of negative 20 million. We're trying to find the change in M1. And what's the reserve requirement ratio? 0.2. Or 5. So reworking this, what's the change in M1? It's 5 times 20 million or negative 100 million. 5 times negative 20 million or a negative 100 million. So in other words, the money supply will go down by $100 million. And once again, be clear, this is the maximum change. That's the maximum change. Because that assumes that banks hold no excess reserves and kind of take this process to its, to its biggest change. What would be the minimum change? Yeah, the minimum change would be a multiplier of 1, right? Minimum change would be where the multiplier is 1, or the change in M1 is just going to be equal to whatever the change in reserves are. So in this case, if the change in reserves is 20 million, then the change in M1 would also be 20 million. And that's the minimum change. What starts this process off? The Fed changing reserves or the Fed changing currency. That's what starts this process off. If I get a tax refund in the mail from the federal government, does that change the money supply? Nice try, Ethan. Sorry, you're up on my screen. I can't see y'all, but I can see you. No, that's just moving money around, right? A tax refund is just taking money from some taxpayers and giving it to me. I go buy a share of stock. Does that change the money supply? No. The only time that the money supply changes is when the Fed is doing this, right? Because what the Fed is doing is they're creating new reserves or new currency. That's what makes it a change in the money supply, right? So just you or me moving money around, that's not changing the money supply, right? So yeah, right? What kicks off the money multiplier process is the Fed putting new reserves or new currency into the economy. That's what's kicking off this process. And remember the intuition, which we went over, I think, pretty carefully yesterday, that the whole intuition of this is that when the Fed creates new reserves, that creates new lending, which means more spending, which creates new reserves, which creates new lending, which creates new spending, and it multiplies and multiplies. One thing we didn't talk about is I guess is kind of an oversight on my part. What determines the size of the money multiplier? The reserve requirement ratio, right? So if the reserve requirement ratio goes up, the multiplier goes down. Does that intuition make sense? Who can explain to me why that is intuitively? Why would the multiplier go down if the reserve requirement ratio goes up?
Because more money would be moving around, and it's able to be used more by other companies to create more reserves, or other banks to create more reserves.
Yeah, right. And why is more money moving around?
Because less of it is being stored at the central bank.
Exactly, exactly. So, well, in this case, I'm talking about an increase in the required reserve ratio, right? So if the required reserve ratio goes up, then the Fed is going to require banks to hold more of their money at reserves and lend less money out. So the more that banks have to hold as reserve and the less they lend out, the smaller the multiplier. So this is, as we talked about in class, this is one of the tools that the Fed has. They could try to change the money supply by, for instance, they could try to lower the money supply by increasing the reserve requirement ratio. Or they could try to increase the money supply by cutting the reserve requirement ratio. That would be a tool that the Fed could use to control policy. But as we said, this is not really something that the Fed wants to do because banks would hate it. It'd be very inefficient and costly for banks. And also it's likely to lead to very big and kind of unpredictable changes in the money supply. The Fed prefers the predictability of open market operations, right? Because it's something that they're good at, quite honestly. But here you can see the tool, right? Changing the required reserve ratio is a tool that the Fed could use to control the money supply if they so wished. Okay, who else has got some questions? While we're talking about multiplier questions, how do we feel about government spending and tax multipliers? See a couple people shaking their heads. If you're shaking your heads, why aren't you asking me questions about this? Am I that intimidating? I hope not. Do you want to work through a multiplier question or two? Sure, let's do it, right? Let's do it. All right, we're going to set ourselves a high bar. Here's a tricky little question for us. Let's say that the government raises both taxes and spending by $20 million. How much would output change if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75? All right, who wants to offer me the first step? What would be the first thing you would do if you saw this question?
Don't you do like 1/1 minus 0.75? Then
Yeah, because what's that the formula for?
the marginal propensity, I forget what it's called, but I just know like you multiply that answer by 20 million. Pretty sure.
Right. Okay, so we got to know, because there's different formulas, right? There's a formula for the government spending multiplier, but then there's a different formula for the tax multiplier. So obviously the first thing is we need to know these formulas, and then we have to take this one at a time. What's going to be the change in output from the change in government spending? And then we got to figure out what's going to be the change in output from the change in taxes. Okay, so let's do the government spending part of this. What's the multiplier? The change in output from a change in government spending is 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. If you don't know these formulas, you're going to be dead in the water tomorrow. That's probably not, I could probably say that a nicer way. You won't, you're going to be in trouble, okay? Saying you're dead in the water is kind of a rough way of saying it. But yeah, you got to know the formulas, right? There's not that many formulas for this class, and these multiplier formulas definitely going to need to know for tomorrow. Okay, so let's do this part. What's the change in G? 20 million. What's marginal propensity to consume? 0.75. So the multiplier is 4. From this change in government spending, we get an increase in $80 million. Okay, using our formula. But note, that's only half the question. The other question is, what else did the government do? It raised taxes. What's the tax multiplier?
Negative MPC over 1 minus MPC.
Right. And notice it's negative, reflecting the fact that when taxes go up, output's going to go down. So in this case, the increase in taxes is actually going to reduce output. By how much? Well, taxes went up 20 million. That's the MPC. Our multiplier for the taxes is -3. So from the change in taxes, we have -60 million. What then is the net effect? Well, how much did output change from G? 80 million. How much did output change from the change in T? -60. The net effect is that output went up by 20 million. Wait a second, why didn't these just offset each other? If I just go back to the question, we changed government spending and taxes by 20 million. Why didn't these two things just offset each other and there's no change in output? Why? Why is there a change in output here if we increase taxes and increase government spending by the same amount?
Well, because of how the government purchases multiplier works, you know that in that very first round that we were talking about, you're going to get 100% in, versus when you're talking about taxes, you don't get it.
Exactly, right? The government spending multiplier is bigger than the tax multiplier, right? For just the reason Isabella said, that when the government spends 50 million, they spend all 50 million. When the government gives you a tax cut of 50 million, not all of that 50 million is going to get spent. Some of it's going to get saved. And so notice here that the government spending multiplier is 4, but the tax multiplier is -3. So in absolute value, government spending is more powerful than tax cuts. And this was, we made a point of talking about this in class. This is the reason why Keynesians prefer government spending over tax cuts. Because with government spending, you get more bang for your buck. You're going to get more actual spending and a bigger change in aggregate demand. Okay? So, right, there's I would say an example of a harder question related to this, but once again, you got to know the formulas, right? This was definitely a problem with the quiz yesterday, where many of you just weren't prepared to answer these questions because you didn't know what the formula is. And once again, why do we get a government spending multiplier? Because more spending leads to more income, which leads to more spending, which leads to more income, right? That the way that initial spending creates new income for some people, which leads to their spending more, which creates new income for other people, which leads to them spending more, right? We get that multiplier effect.
Hey Todd, could we
Yeah.
do a rule of 70 problem?
Sure. Bradley, what's the rule of 70? Remember?
I'm not quite sure. It's in my notes. Well, oh yeah, every 70 years it doubles. But if we could just like do a problem like we had on the quiz where we were figuring out, I don't know, I can't remember what the question was, but if it like doubled one more time in the same set of time.
Well, first off, we got to get this rule of 70 right, because I don't think you had it exactly right.
Okay.
And not to pick on you, but we talked about this in first year seminar class. Not just you, all of you first years talked about this, right? So we should, hopefully we get this right this time. If we didn't get it in first year seminar, we should get it right here. If something grows at G%, it doubles in size 70 divided by G years. Okay. Okay, let's think about two regions of the world, Africa and Asia. Which one was richer? And we'll make it a nice round number. 1880. Africa was richer than Asia in 1880 on a per capita basis. It was about 25% richer than Africa. So in other words, if income was $125 per person in Africa, it was $100 per person in Asia. However, what's happened since 1880? Asia has grown a lot faster. Why? In part because Asia's been much more open to trade than most of Africa. So just for argument's sake, let's say that Asia, let's do 3% a year, and Africa is doubled, growing about 1% a year. So using the rule of 70, how long would it take Africa to double in size if it's growing at 1% a year?
70 years.
Yeah, right. Not too hard, right? 70 years. So in other words, in 1950, they'll be at 250. And in 2020, they'll double again. They'll be at 500. Well, this example works out really nice. Why didn't I ask you this question on the exam? This is a good exam question. I got to remember this. All right. Now, let's think about Asia. If they're growing at 3% a year, how long does it take them to double in size?
23 years.
Yeah, about 23 years, right? So I didn't really do this right, but so they will double. I should have spread this out more. Shoot. So they, by, let's see, 1903, they'll be at 200. By 1930, they'll be at 400. And in 1950, they'll be at 800. 1973, they'll be at 1600. 1996, they'll be at 3200. And 2020, it'll be 6400, right? Notice how many more times Asia is doubling. And so instead of being 25% poor, Asia is now what, like 128 times richer? No, sorry. No, that's not right. What, about 12 times richer? Roughly, a little bit more than 12 times richer, almost 13 times. So the rule of 70 is just a rule of thumb, right? It's just a rule of thumb for us to kind of convert growth rates, which are a little hard for us to understand intuitively, into something more easier for us to understand, which is levels, right? And so the key to talking about this is that small differences in growth rates lead to big differences in incomes over time, right? And that's exactly what's happened in Asia and Africa, right? Asia's gone from being a little bit behind Africa to being significantly ahead of Africa as a region, in part because it's just grown a little bit faster. And a large part of that can be attributed to the fact that Asia has opened itself up to international trade in ways that most African countries have not. Okay, I'm going to change gears here, and I see that there's a question from one of you in the chat to talk about debt tolerance and give me an example. So debt tolerance basically means how confident are markets that you will repay your debt. If markets are very confident that you're going to repay your debt, then there's a high level, your country has a high level of debt tolerance. If your country has if markets are not confident that your country will pay your debt, then there's a low level of debt tolerance. There is no magic formula for what determines a country's debt tolerance. It's a complex mix of their history, of the institutions, of their political systems. But we know a few things for sure. One is we know that Argentina has very low debt tolerance. Why? Because they have a dysfunctional government with relatively poor institutions, and they defaulted 4 times in the last 20 years. So what does that mean? Markets do not have much confidence that Argentina will repay its debt. And as a result, any debt that Argentina has makes it a very strong candidate for a debt crisis. If you don't have any debt tolerance, you are always going to be a strong candidate for having a debt crisis. But if you do have debt tolerance, regardless of how much debt you have, you're probably not a good candidate for having a debt crisis. So as we talked about on your quiz, Japan has a very high level of debt, but would not be a particularly good candidate for a debt crisis. Why? Because markets have a great deal of confidence that Japan is going to pay back their money. That's part of the reason markets have lent so much to Japan. So, the idea here is, once again, getting back to the role of psychology and confidence and expectations, right? That what markets believe matters. it matters in many ways more than the figures, right? That figure of the debt to GDP ratio, quite honestly, doesn't really tell you anything about how likely a country is to experience a debt crisis. You have to understand more what markets think about the country. And what do markets think? Well, that's in part depend upon the history of the country, its institutions, how strong the economy is, right? These kind of factors. Okay. Okay.
Hey, Todd.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I apologize for the noise outside. We have a kid home from school. We have 2 kids home from school. They're obviously feeling better because one of them is just beating the crap out of the other one outside my door. So I'm just going to pretend I don't hear that. And, you know, we'll kind of have a kind of dog eat dog here. Hopefully they're still alive when class finishes. All right. Or at least one of them's still alive when class finishes. Okay, yeah, somebody had a question.
Could you explain how the race between technology and education impacts income inequality in the U.S.?
Yeah. So this is really looking at the labor market for educated workers. So we have wages, quantity of labor, we have the supply of labor, the demand for labor. And let's just assume, just to keep things simple, that we have a perfectly competitive market. What do we know is happening? Technology is increasing the demand for educated workers. So this is being driven by increases in technology. The technology is increasingly human capital intensive. So most new technologies require a much higher level of education and human capital than technologies in the past. This is going to drive up wages unless we can increase the supply of labor fast enough. But the problem is we're just not doing that. Yes, the supply of educated workers is going up, but it's not going up fast enough. And so the result is that wages are getting driven up for educated workers. Who are these educated workers? They were workers that were already doing very well. They're also workers that likely came from families that have 2 parents with 2 incomes. We know this for a fact, that kids who go to college are comparatively better off than kids who don't go to college. And so in other words, this race that the US is losing is driving up wages for educated workers and helping those that are already the richest workers in the economy. As a result, it's increasing inequality, right? It's contributing to inequality. It's not the only thing that's contributing to inequality, but it is one of the things that's driving up inequality, is that we're simply not creating enough educated workers to keep up with the demand for educated workers. We need to get more poor people in education, quite honestly. I mean, that's where this has got to come from. From the children of people who don't have a college education, we need to get them a college education. And we're not doing that. We're not doing that at the rate that we need to prevent wages from skyrocketing, which is what we're doing, what's happening right now. So, right, briefly, that is the race between technology and education. Having talked about all that, this is not on the exam tomorrow. Oh, yes, it is. Sorry, what am I thinking? I was thinking we talked about this in chapter 8, but yeah, we also talked about this with inequality. Thank you. Yeah, so yeah, this is on the exam. But you also had a question on this on exam number 1, if you remember, that was related to this. Okay. Are we all questioned out?
Could you quick go over the difference between M1, M2, and how they contribute to monetary supply or money supply and was it monetary base?
Yeah, so these are just different definitions of the money supply, right? These are just definitional things. So M1 is currency plus deposits. M2 is everything in M1 plus savings accounts. Basically, savings accounts. I think in class I also mentioned like small certificates of deposits and money market accounts, but those are basically savings accounts. And the monetary base is part of M1. It's currency plus reserves. So it's the part of the M1 that the Fed controls. So those are just kind of definitional things. And as I said in class, when I talk about the money supply, we typically talk about M1. Though in this day and age, it's becoming really hard to say exactly what is money, particularly in this age of electronic money where people are using lots of different ways to pay for things. I think the nature of money is changing. So yeah, when your kids take intro to macro, they might learn something much different about how economists define money than you guys are learning. Okay, anything else? Okay, well, I hear some whimpering out there, so I will either I'll go out and try to comfort the kid who lost the big battle royale outside my office. But okay, thank you very much. If questions come up that need to be answered, you can send me an email tonight. I'll also try to show up a couple of minutes early to the exam tomorrow. Yeah, reach out. But other than that, we'll expect to see you in person, unless you're somebody who's taking the class online the entire block. You need to show up in person. If you cannot show up in person, you got to let me know. Okay, but I will expect to see the vast majority of you in person, right in Hedges tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Okay. Okay, everyone. Have a good evening. Good luck studying.